How did we get news in those days? Before transistors, a radio set was equipped with valves and was relatively large. Front-line units would therefore not have one. Listening to radio news broadcasts, except for the official one, was therefore not possible. This meant that we were practically cut off from all sources of information beyond our immediate vicinity. We really did live in the valley of the ignorant. This made it all the easier for rumours to blossom. One could pick up a lot in field post letters from home, but these were a long time in coming and had to first pass through the censor. We learned a lot from official channels and through contact with the higher command authorities. We had contact with the Luftwaffe on Rostov airfield. It was from here that the supply aircraft took off for Stalingrad, but now there was little activity of that kind. The airmen told us that they couldn't land in Stalingrad anymore, only parachute drop their cargoes. The Russians had broken through and split up the pocket. The wounded couldn't be flown out. It must have been ghastly what was happening there. On the 2nd of February 1943, the last German resistance was extinguished. Several 100,000 soldiers went into captivity. We knew that from the Luftwaffe. The events there affected us to the very core, and our faith in the leadership suffered a heavy blow. Until then, we had been certain that they would always find a way to get us out if we were cut off, surrounded, or got ourselves into some other hopeless situation. This confidence had now been shattered. Sixth Army had been quite consciously and senselessly sacrificed. We often spoke about it and blamed the highest political leadership, but also the military commanders, who had allowed the moment to slip away when the chance still existed to break out from Stalingrad and save thousands of our men. Stalingrad was a turning point in not only the military sense, but also the psychological one. Nothing would ever be as it was before. On the 8th of February, the whole Abteilung pulled out of Rostov. Parts of the city were already in Russian hands. For 3 whole days we warded off strong attacks and destroyed many of their tanks, including some American types. Then my own panzer had radiator damage and needed attention at the workshop, which had no fixed location during the retreat. I received the order to get all damaged Tigers to the workshop and arrived at Taganrog on the Sea of Azov 2 days later with a convoy of 5 Tigers and 10 tractors. The journey was very difficult because the Rollbahn crossed many sections of iced-over gulches. At Taganrog, I requested special railway wagons, which appeared as if by a miracle, and I loaded up my fighting force. We left Taganrog station on the last train out, destination unknown. The transport commander had no idea what to do with us in the confusion of the retreat. The Russians had pushed very far forward and broken into the Donets Basin, the great industrial conurbation of the Soviet Union. The permanent way was broken in many places, so I could not transport my panzers back. I succeeded in contacting the Abteilung through Corps at Stalino. The workshop was being moved to Mariupol, and I headed there. Left to our own devices, we helped ourselves to food from poorly guarded provisions trains and compounds, and so did not live badly on the way there. At Mariupol, the panzers were dealt with in descending order, depending on the seriousness of the damage, and so I got my panzer back after 10 days' stay at the workshop. I finally left with this vehicle at the beginning of March 1943 and set off for my company, which was occupying a collective farm behind the Mius front. A few days before, the Abteilung had wiped out a Russian tank corps, which had broken through the Mius position. After a few days, the company was transferred to Pokrovskoye on the Mius, about 20 kilometers east of Taganrog. Here we stayed 6 weeks, expecting a Russian attack. Besides vehicle care, we had the usual duties, but also reconnoitred the entire area, which included regular visits to the infantry in the front-line trenches. Frequently, very senior officers came to look over our Tigers. In the evening, I often sat with the commander and played scat, which usually involved me in heavy losses. Meanwhile, the period of mud had arrived and the Mius thawed. The company got wonderful pike, perch and carp from a fisherman. We watched a film, Wehrmachen music with Ilse Werner, and the whole time we indulged ourselves with alcohol. At that time, Hauptmann Lang was transferred back to Germany with heart and liver complaints, and Oberleutnant Scherf, who had commanded a platoon until then, was made company commander. Lieutenant Weinert received I platoon, I got 2 platoon and Oberfeldwebel under Haydn got 3 platoon with the Panzer IIIs. Also at Pokrovskoye, we received Russian volunteers, Hiwis, who stayed with us loyally until the end of the war. According to an edict from Army High Command, Hiwis were to replace as many German soldiers as possible in the supply services. Hiwises wore German uniform without insignia, received pay appropriate to their grade, and carried out duties not requiring a weapon. Sheriff gave me instructions to recruit as many of them as I could. I placed my requirements before the local mayor, who was not very taken with the idea, but within an hour a young man reported to me. He spoke good German and wanted to accompany us. Alex hated the Soviets. He was given a uniform, the same issue of clothing as ourselves, a week's pay, evening rations with cigarettes, and was happy. In his new gear he strutted up and down the village street, admired by the local beauties, of which there were quite a few. Alex could be very useful to us as an interpreter. He rode in the sidecar of one of our dispatch riders, Gefreiter Reichmann, the pair of them becoming an inseparable team. Later, Alex got himself a Russian submachine gun because he did not like being unarmed. Next day, encouraged by Alex, another 10 young men came forward for their uniform, pay and cigarettes. I chose 6 of them, a tailor, a cobbler, and 4 men for the fuel detail. When we withdrew from the Meuse region in April 1943, and the Russians occupied it later on, there was no going home for these Hiwis. When leave was given out, all our Russians were taken by men of our company to stay with their families in Germany. We did what we could to lessen the burden of their fate, and for us they became members of our company. On Easter Sunday we received orders to move out. The entire Abteilung was transferred to the Belgorod area, about 60 km north of Kharkov. This came with rumours of a new German offensive for the spring of 1943. I was advance party leader for the Abteilung and had to arrange parking for all the companies who would be arriving the next day. No 3 company was given a very beautiful wood just coming into leaf. Each crew put up a tent and settled in as best they could. The days were filled with technical work. After the long journey there was plenty to do, the panzer tracks in particular needing attention, and furthermore things had to be readied for the imminent operation. The territory and roads to the front, which ran about 30 kilometres along the Donets, had to be scouted and all commanders given a most exact picture. I reconnoitred personally the possibilities of crossing the Donets at the Belgorod bridgehead. Day and night huge convoys drove along the nearby Kharkov-Belgorod Rollbahn. Almost all SS divisions were represented. Grass airstrips had been laid out all around for the Luftwaffe, heavy flak in emplacements everywhere to cover the massive advance. The Russians made a few bombing raids by day and often at night, but were not very successful. Meanwhile, new Tigers had arrived for my Abteilung from Germany, which now had to be unloaded and transferred to the companies. A great amount of work was required to get these panzers operational, some being already damaged, and this took several days. Each company now had 14 Tigers, the Abteilung as a whole 45. We had given away the remainder of our Panzer IIIs. Besides the work, we spent some very pleasant hours. Quite close by was a beautiful lake for bathing, though the water was very cold. Reasons for festivities were sought and found. We had several promotions to celebrate, for which the commander always released plenty of alcohol. Those who over-celebrated could sleep it off in the open. At this time there occurred a change of Spies. The former CSM had volunteered to command a Tiger, and Stabsfeldwebel Kisseberth took over from him. This was all properly celebrated. Every evening I arranged for the company band, consisting of 2 accordions, a violin and a drum, to give a concert which the whole company would attend. It was a very pleasant camp life. To enhance our living conditions, I held a competition for my platoon. The crew which set up the best tent and surroundings would receive a bottle of cognac. All crews worked at it for 2 days until I awarded the prize to Panzer 323. My platoon had rigged up tables, benches, washing facilities, lighting and much more in the short time allowed. Every day we awaited the order to commence the operation, the fire fueled by the craziest rumours. But nobody knew anything definite. At the beginning of May, I discovered that the planned offensive had been postponed for several weeks, and the Abteilung would be returning to Kharkov. The company was kept in the dark about it all. I went as the advance party leader to Kharkov to set up quarters. The lodgings were very nice, each panzer crew having its own little house. In my house were 3 adjoining rooms, one for me, the second for the Unteroffiziers Fuhrmeister and Ziegler, and the third for Obergefreiters Spiekermann and Workmeister. I had a beautiful room with a writing desk, sofa and white bed. The billeting people were very attentive towards me. After the primitive experiences of the past, I could ask for nothing more. The commander had the best quarters, a living room with piano and a bedroom. This was the venue for our larger festivities to which the officers of the other companies were invited, and which generally ended in the early hours. The longer these parties went on, however, the more important it was that the next day should start punctually. The company often had the opportunity to visit the theatre or cinema. I saw an excellent performance of The Gypsy Baron by Ukrainian actors, though never understanding a word of it. I spent a lot of time in my VW searching out additional sources of food for the company, and so got to know Kharkov and its surrounding districts with all its collective farms and stores intimately. Of all the Russian cities of over 1 million inhabitants that I saw, this was the one I liked best. The city centre today is just as it was before the war. Small, single-storey houses, mostly brick-built and embellished with carved work. Only a few districts had suffered badly from the earlier fighting. The city centre was fully European, some parts positively American. The buildings were very impressive. The city streets were broad and clean. Trams and trolleybus routes went everywhere. Large department stores were to be found alongside concert cafes in which anything could be ordered, from pure coffee to whipped cream. But at what a price! My gunner came back one evening having spent 40 Reichsmarks. What was really surprising was how quickly the citizens of Kharkov had adjusted to the new situation. Everywhere, German advertisements were to be found alongside Russian posters. Commerce flourished and exceeded that of a German city in peacetime. We had a change of commander. Hauptmann Graf Kaganek brought dash and refinement to the Abteilung. We would go through fire for him. We knew meanwhile that Operation Citadel was planned, but not the date. We were also advised that in the coming operation the Abteilung would not work as an integrated unit. No one company would be subordinated to 6 Panzer Division, 2 Company to 19 Panzer Division, and our 3 Company to 7 Panzer Division. The pace of everything was stepped up. Once the panzers were in shape, we had panzer battle instruction, lessons in tactics and exercises. Twice a week in the afternoon, we had officers' training with map exercises or conferences about the terrain. The platoons went daily to the environs of the city in order to complete their own training. Great activity prevailed in the Tiger driving schools, from where the greatest possible numbers of panzer drivers had to be obtained. In places, the terrain around the city was very difficult and made great demands on the drivers. I had to take charge of driver training. Oberleutnant Scherf convinced himself now and again of the progress being made. At that time, the Tiger and its capabilities were fairly unfamiliar to the men in the field. To illustrate this and other new weapons, 7 Panzer Division, to which 3 Company belonged, held a demonstration before an audience of illustrious spectators. All commanders from the divisions, regiments and Abteilungen of the Corps were ordered to attend. With my platoon, I had to pass through a swampy area which had been made passable by a log road made by pioneers of the Grenadier Regiment. Would it withstand our 58-tonners? I led my platoon safely over this log road with its tree trunks, but by the 4th, Tiger things got very problematic. Next, I had to lead our platoon down a woodland track. Seeing a large group of spectators standing either side, I suspected that this was where the next event was to happen. And I was right. Suddenly, smoke bombs with tear gas were hurled by grenadiers at my panzer from both sides. Turret hatch shut, gas masks on. An unpleasant, acrid, dense smoke filled the interior, enshrouding the driver. I ordered him to go full ahead and directed our vehicle out of the woods. It hadn't affected us much, and we were still operational, but the poor grenadiers caught some of the smoke. The remainder of the exercise went off smoothly, and we left behind a very good impression. We had practical gunnery training on the nearby front at Chugyev on the Donets. I and my platoon were subordinated to one of the infantry divisions there for 3 days. We fired from 3 different spots as ordered by the sector commanders at the easy-to-hit Russian positions on the forward slope. The infantry was extremely grateful to us. Now they would have some peace for a while. As confirmed by the infantrymen, my platoon destroyed around 60 bunkers, anti-tank gun and mortar emplacements. My platoon had 1 man slightly wounded. We considered the whole thing as light entertainment. Towards the end of our time in Kharkov, I got to know a German farm manager who was in charge of a collective farm nearby. I had come across this collective farm in my search for fresh vegetables and potatoes for our field kitchen. We received only the dried type, which we had had up to here. When he heard my surname, he told me that there was a Russian family called Rosen in Kharkov, which came from an old line of nobility. He said he would look up the address so that I could research further. I knew that there was a branch of the Rosen line which my family had lost contact with since the Russian Revolution. I knew from the family history that a certain Andreas had lived in the Kharkov area, but the sudden order to move out prevented me from making further inquiries. At the beginning of June, I received my orders for the coming operation. From the beginning of the attack, my 2 platoon would be attached to Panzer Grenadier Regiment 7 Panzer Division. This regiment was to cross the Donets using inflatable boats and establish a bridgehead on the enemy bank. For lack of a bridge, my platoon of Tigers would have to ford the river and support the regiment's attack. For this purpose, I was to make immediate contact with the foremost elements right on the Donets in the sector they occupied south of Belgorod, and we were to reconnoitre together for a suitable place for my Tigers to cross. It was a beautiful summer's day when I arrived. From an observation post well forward, I had a view over the downward slope to the Donets, the 2 riverbanks, both bushy and overgrown, and the gentle rise of the land on the far bank where the Russians had their front-line positions and were dug in. At the river itself there were only a few German outposts, and so we assumed the same for the Russian side, but naturally nothing was known for sure. Towards evening, the commander of 6th Panzer Pioneer Platoon, Oberfeldwebel Baumann, and 2 corporals, reported to me. They would be leading the necessary pioneer part of the operation. When it was dark and the moon hidden by cloud, we went with a Panzer Grenadier scouting party down the kilometre or so to the river's edge. No sound could be heard but the murmur of the waters. The Russian side was as silent as the grave. The high undergrowth was favourable for an approach to the riverbank. I took a good look at it. It stood vertical about 1.5 meters above the water. If the far bank was the same, mounting it from out of the water would be difficult. Now we had to measure the depth of the water and the suitability of the riverbed for a 58-ton Tiger. In the opinion of the Grenadiers, who had been here a week, this was the shallowest part in the entire sector. I got undressed and the Grenadiers took up positions along the riverbank. I listened out for any activity on the Russian side and then slipped into the water, only 1.5 meters deep. The waters flowed past calmly and I waded, only my head above water, to the other bank. The riverbed was firm and not muddy, but the bank on the other side was as steep as our own. Furthermore, the bank fell almost vertically for about 2.5 meters. The Tigers could not manage that. I regained our side of the Donets, was pulled out and helped up, and then we held a conference in the cover of the bushes. Oberfeldwebel Baumann, the pioneer, saw no great difficulty in flattening the riverbanks with explosives to make it negotiable for the Tigers. The bed of the river itself and the depth of water did not present us with a problem. Back at the Panzer Grenadiers command post, we were served hot tea, and then the plan for crossing the Donets was agreed upon. I returned to Kharkov that night in good humour. Our task was now clear, but what remained unknown was the date when it would all start. The 28th of June 1943 was my 21st birthday, and I had come of age. Oberleutnant Scherf handed me a certificate confirming this fact. In the evening we had something of a banquet with much alcohol flowing, attended even by our new Abteilung commander, Major Graf Kaganek. My parents told me in a letter that they had sent me 2 black currant cakes and 2 cheesecakes. I cannot remember what else there was to eat, but it would certainly not have been just soldiers' rations. A few days later, we were informed that the attack would begin on the 5th of July. The Russians in Kharkov had already told us that 3 weeks earlier. On the 1st of July, the Abteilung moved back to a readiness area 30 kilometers south of Belgorod, which we had occupied before we got to Kharkov. The arrival of the newest German panzer, the Panther, was awaited. None of this would come as a surprise to the enemy. Since the beginning of March, he would naturally have been well informed of the forward progress of the German forces, from which he would not have found it difficult to predict their intentions. The projection of his front line either side of Kursk offered the chance of a pincer attack, which would not only shorten the German front line by 150 km, but also isolate a large part of his operational forces at the border between the central and southern front. It was clear to us that the Russians had used the time to expand their defensive positions. They had also brought up reserves, and so we knew that the operation was not going to be easy. Moreover, we had not anticipated the extent of the expansion of the defences. They had made great strides in the training of their officers and men, and we would discover that the Russian soldier we would face was no longer the man of 1941 too, but a soldier our equal in fighting efficiency and morale. On the day before the attack, the company moved out at around 18 o'clock and headed towards Belgorod, where a readiness area was occupied behind the companies of Panzer Grenadier Regiment 7. The 4 panzers of my 2 platoon drove further on to join the advanced elements of Regiment 7. As some weeks previously, I stood at the edge of the woods above the gentle downward slope to the Donets. Oberfeldwebel Baumann arrived with his Panzer Pioneer platoon, and now we waited. My men slept in the panzer, which I would like to have done as well, but the responsibility of being the can opener for the panzer units following up put a heavy burden on my shoulders. The next morning, at 4:15 on the 5th of July, a 40-minute period of softening up by artillery and Luftwaffe heralded the attack in our sector. The men of Panzer Grenadier Regiments 6 and 7 and Oberfeldwebel Baumann's Pioneers went down quickly to the Donets. While the first inflatable boats were crossing, the Pioneers prepared the explosive charges to reduce the height of the fording points on the riverbanks. Our engines were warm, the crews in their positions, the radio plugged in. We awaited the signal to go. From beyond the far bank we heard the first sounds of fighting, the rattle of MGs, the rumble of Russian mortars and artillery. In the pale light of dawn, the mushroom clouds of smoke from impacting shells were visible. Finally the signal came. 2 green flares from Oberfeldwebel Baumann told us that the demolition charges had been laid. Panzer Marsch! Flat out we crossed the open terrain and in full view of the enemy headed for the fording point. The order in which my 4 panzers would cross the river and where the others would wait had been set down precisely. Baumann confirmed all clear, with a movement of his hand. We manoeuvred down the reduced slope at slow speed, went into the water, motored across to the other bank and began the climb out. The explosion had loosened the earth considerably, and the surge of water forced back towards the bank by the bow of the panzer clogged the bankside with mud. As my panzer began to climb up out of the river, the tracks had no firm ground to grip and slipped round. A second attempt was equally unsuccessful, and now we began to receive mortar fire uncomfortably close. This was not good. I reported by radio the failure of the fording attempt and received the order to remain where I was with my platoon. Soon the commander of the Pioneer Battalion appeared. He had orders to erect a bridge with a capacity of 60 tons near my fording points. My job was to protect the Pioneers, for a Russian counterattack was possible. First, I had to get my panzer ashore again on our side of the river. Feldwebel Weigel's Tiger 324 had to tow my vehicle up the bank. His gunner, Unteroffizier Jackal, carried out the very arduous task of attaching the towing hawser to the rear of my panzer, for the coupling hooks were under water and difficult to release. We were obliged to stand chest-high in water for this work, while subjected to Russian harassing fire. It succeeded, the panzer was towed out, and now we positioned ourselves at the bridge-building point, where meanwhile the first Pioneer vehicles had arrived. It was calculated that it would take 5 hours to build the bridge, during which time the Panzer Grenadiers would have no tank support. Soon the first wounded came back in the inflatable boats. They were not friendly greetings they shouted at us. The Russian resistance was strong and well organized. The two attacking Panzer Grenadier regiments had sustained many casualties and were making only slow progress. For us, the waiting at the river was almost insufferable, constant mortar fire. We felt sorry for the pioneers working without cover. Additionally, it was getting hotter, and the air in the panzer, where we were condemned to inactivity, ever stuffier. I don't know exactly when they finished the bridge. It must have been around 14 o'clock. Start up and drive across the bridge and through the territory which the Grenadiers had overcome during the morning. I reached the railway line, crossed it near Razumnoye station, and found the command post of Panzer Grenadier Regiment 7. The foremost Russian defensive position, which had held up our grenadiers for so long, was right here at the railway line. Short situation report using a map, brief instructions to my panzer commanders, and we set off. We reached the leading grenadier companies and were involved in bitter fighting the whole afternoon. The Russians had built a deep-layered defensive system with earth bunkers and anti-tank guns, superbly camouflaged and therefore difficult to spot. The grenadiers heaved a sigh of relief that they had us to get this enemy off their backs, as they already had enough to do dealing with Red infantry in countless foxholes and MG nests, which had to be winkled out in hand-to-hand fighting. Here we could be of little assistance, for the Russians allowed our panzers to trundle over their holes, and then they appeared in front of the grenadiers, coming up behind us with all the more determination. We fired only he shells. I cannot remember seeing an enemy tank on this first day. When darkness fell, we came away from the road and received from Company Tross fuel, ammunition and rations. During the night, I received my orders for the next day. Oberleutnant Scherf had crossed the Donitz Bridge immediately behind my platoon, leading platoons 1 and the 3rd. He had fought in the Panzer Grenadier Regiment 6 area, which lay on the left flank of Regiment 7, and therefore had had the strongly fortified and very bitterly defended village of Razumnoye on his left flank to contend with. I have the impression that the Russian defence on the outskirts of this village was more determined than I have just described for my own area with Panzer Grenadier Regiment 7. The entire attack on this first day took place after crossing the Donets in the valley of the Razumnoye River. This area was very difficult to survey. Many bushes and much shrubbery reduced vision, while stagnant waters and numerous swamps canalised the action. The battle area of Panzer Grenadier Regiment 7 was bordered to the right by a steep, rugged range of hills. The strongly defended town of Krutoy Log lay on the plateau of the latter. The 7 Panzer Division attack was to have been continued against it. The difference in height was about 50 metres, and there were only a few tracks rising steeply upwards from out of the valley. During the night, the Grenadiers captured a track by use of which 7th Reconnaissance Abteilung secured a small bridgehead on the plateau as a starting point for future attacks. On the 6th of July, I was subordinated directly with my 2 platoon to Panzer Regiment 25 and was given their radio codes, which changed daily. My orders were to reach the plateau in the early morning using the track cleared by the Grenadiers, and there expand the bridgehead to the north and east, so that Panzer Regiment 25, following up, could take it over for their jumping-off point to attack. Then, upon receiving the order, we would return and, together with the spearhead company of Panzer Regiment 25, break through the defensive position thought to be there and carry forward the attack into the hinterland, passing Batratskaya Dacha. The climb to the plateau was difficult, but passed off without breakdowns. We assumed battle formation, and initially, without coming across the enemy, headed in the direction ordered. On the horizon, about 3 km away, I made out a broad area of woodland across my line of advance. I felt uneasy about it, and we approached slowly. Then I had my platoon halt to wait for Zizreg 25 behind me to catch up. I opened my turret hatch and saw that I was directly alongside a foxhole from where a Red Army soldier looked up at me in fear. I beckoned him to come up and then make his way to the rear. He made no move. I drew my pistol and repeated my hand movements, making clear to him what he had to do. No reaction. I fired a round near the foxhole to reinforce my order. No reaction. Then I took a hand grenade, pulled out the pin and threw it down. The Russian picked it up and threw it back at the panzer. In the face of such courage, I drove forward 50 meters. He would have been captured by the grenadiers following later. I have no idea how long we remained stationary there. The ascent from the Razumnoy Valley to the plateau took the Panzer Regiment some time, for the access route was not without its problems. When Abteilung had arrived and taken up its attack positions, I received the radio message to advance. About 30 to 40 Panzer IIIs and IVs were behind my platoon. What was behind them I do not know, but I assume it was Panzer Grenadier Regiment 7. Everything before all this had been a mere prelude. The opposition we were about to encounter was something we had never experienced before. Our panzers set off again and approached the wood. There was no way through it except through a glade to the right, which forced us to close up, but there was no alternative. Therefore we drove towards the glade. To the left it was about 500 meters to the wood, to the right a bit more, but it was also thick woodland there too. Suddenly we saw muzzle flashes, at first from the right, but not from standard anti-tank guns, whose flashes were different. Afterwards I established that they came from Su-152 self-propelled assault guns, armed with a 152mm flat trajectory howitzer, which we had not previously come up against. They had a low profile and were therefore easy to camouflage but slow in reloading. My two Tigers of the right-hand group were in good form, engaged the enemy and shot better than the Russians. Black smoke rose up from the vehicles hit, but at the same moment the Russians opened up from the edge of the wood to the left 4, 5, 6 muzzle flashes like a necklace of pearls. They seemed to be T-34S. We knocked out some of them and then felt our way cautiously forward. When we had the wood closer on both sides, we received fire from the left again, but the right side was silent. My Tiger was hit, but the front armour was thick, and thank heavens the tracks and wheels escaped damage. I don't know for certain how many of them we finished off. It was unpleasant driving through the woodland glade. Apparently the Russians had either not defended the wood in depth or we were going into a trap. We discovered later that their hidden anti-tank guns let us pass by without firing, in order to get at the lighter armoured Panzer IIIs and IVs behind us. Thus Panzer Regiment 25 had some losses here. Our initially rapid advance now developed into a tough struggle through this deep-layered Russian defensive front. We were continually raked by fire from right and left. It was of some comfort for me that the tanks of Panzer Regiment 25 were close behind. From the map I saw that we were coming to a ridge, or better still an extended rise, around which we had to detour in order to maintain the direction of advance. We kept going. The glade broadened out, and I saw the rise before me about 2 km ahead. I was just thinking that we were through the defensive positions, when more than 20 barrels flashed from countless anti-tank guns dug in on the forward slope of the rise. It was not possible to determine at first whether they had heavy-caliber guns and dug-in tanks there also. We stopped and then turned about for cover. Never before had we come across such a concentration of firepower. I reported this by radio and the Panzer Regiment answered swiftly, "Hold your position," Luftwaffe requested. Shortly afterwards, Luftwaffe attack in 30 minutes. It was a summer's day and boiling hot inside the Panzer. We were sweating, thirsty, hands and faces black with powder smoke, but now at least it was possible to open the hatches a little and let in some air. During an attack, the hatches had to remain shut. On these first Tiger models, the commander had a cupola about 20 centimeters high, with observation slits of glass blocks. The hatch lid remained upright when open, and was the aiming point for all manner of enemy projectiles. Head injuries were common amongst tank commanders, so we proceeded with the hatch closed, but vision severely hampered. Later, Tiger models had a recessed commander's cupola and corner periscopes for vision, and so the head was much better protected. When opened, the turret lid remained horizontal, so that even in an attack the cupola could be kept open. Now began a fantastic show. Wave upon wave of Stukas with sirens wailing dived down on the Russian positions to give them hell. It was a brief but effective spectacle. Everything must have been totally churned over. The last Stukas had not yet left when the order came by radio to move out. We drove through the narrows between the woodland and the rise and past the totally wiped-out positions. The worst seemed behind us, but it was a hard nut we had had to crack. My panzer drove the furthest left, near the edge of the wood, the other 3 panzers to my right and with a good distance between them. Suddenly there was a powerful jerk, almost as if the panzer had made a small jump. Unteroffizier Ziegler, my driver, pulled up at once. I opened the cupola and saw the right track lying behind us. We had run over a mine. I warned my platoon and the regiment by radio. At first there was a general halt. The spearhead company of the Panzer Regiment swung wide and passed us, taking over the lead. 2 Tigers of my platoon attached themselves to the spearhead, my 3rd Panzer, Oberfeldwebel Burgesses. I retained for close protection. I sat with the gunner behind the panzer in the rut we had left so as not to step on a mine. The damage was not too bad. The panzer was standing on the torn track, unrolled to its full length. First, we had to inspect the ground around the panzer for mines to ensure that nobody got blown up during the repair. The radio operator stayed by his equipment. The rest of the crew searched. Apparently, just a few mines had been strewn very quickly near the edge of the wood. We found 8 to 10 mines in wooden boxes, not dug in, but left loose and covered over with grass for camouflage. The fuse could be unscrewed without any danger. All commanders had practiced doing this in preparation for Zitadel, and so now it paid off. The panzers of the regiment had gone on ahead. Oberstleutnant Schulz, its commanding officer, stopped briefly to exchange a few words. I told him, "I will try to catch up once we move off." The important thing now was to replace the track and change its 3 damaged segments. This was grueling work. Everything was heavy. To my surprise and joy, the main body of the regiment was followed by supply vehicles and a 1-ton tractor of our 3-company repair group. A half-track, fully mobile cross-country, it followed at the rear of the regiment, ready to provide help quickly in the event of a breakdown. It was naturally very helpful to us. The experienced mechanics got to work and, much quicker than we could have done it alone, had us mobile again. The damage to the track was insignificant and could be attended to later. Thanks, handshakes and mount up to chase after the regiment. We found it northwest of Batratskaya Dacha. The leading elements had come across another Russian defensive line. The right flank on the heavily defended village side was vacant and exposed. This was secured by other forces. We adopted an all-round defence or hedgehog and posted sentries all around. We, who had spent all day as the battering ram, could now rest. In the course of the night, we replenished fuel and ammunition and changed the oil and radiator water. First the horse and then the rider. This cavalry motto also applied to us. First tend to and make ready the panzer, then the man. We slept behind the panzer. Hard and short. I can only attempt to reconstruct Oberleutnant Scherf's operation with our 3-company, less my 2 platoon. The company was deployed first on the 6th of July at Krutoy Log on the plateau, I assume together with 2 Apt Panzer Regiment 25. As I recall, it was plain to me that Panzer Regiment 25 operated in 2 separate groups. At Krutoy Log, 3 company had 2 killed. Feldwebel Heinz Wunderlich of the repair group, and Obergefreiter Adalbert Essler, radio operator in a I platoon panzer. After 106 Impfdiv became involved in the battle for Krutoy Log, and the situation improved, Saku Apt Panzer Regiment 25 and 3 company heavy PZAPT 503 followed the advancing Y Apt Panzer Regiment 25. This attack group also tangled with the 2nd Russian defensive line in the wooded area, and Red Army troops left lying in wait, but then followed I Abteilung's line of advance until ordered to protect the right flank against the village at Batratskaya Dacha. In the fighting there on the evening of the 6th of July, 3 company heavy SAPT 503 had 4 dead. Unteroffizier Ernst Angerer of the repair group, Unteroffizier Herbert Petzker, gunner, Wilhelm Stuhler and Robert Steininger, loaders. On the 3rd day of the attack, the 7th of July, I took up my former position as can opener with my 4 Tigers leading. I thought it was unlikely to be any more difficult than the previous day. Soon after setting out in the early morning, we came across another Russian defensive line, much weaker than expected and without any depth, and broke through it relatively quickly. On that day, I don't remember that we had any stronger resistance than that to break down, We advanced. Now and again we came across groups of Russian stragglers, but no cohesive or organized resistance. Towards evening we were near Miaswedovo, a heavily defended crossroads. Our panzer grenadiers forced their way into the town, while we ourselves remained outside. During the course of the next day, we moved up to protect the right flank of 7 Panzer Division on high ground, about 4 km southeast of Miaswedovo. Panzer Regiment 6 had previously captured it. We positioned ourselves on a reverse slope, far away from the panzers of I-Apt Panzer Regiment 25. I had orders to protect the main body to the east. I positioned myself with 2 panzers behind the crest so that I could observe and fire over it without offering myself as a target. Before me lay a moderate slope with the occasional bush. In the valley bottom, in a large semicircle, was sparse deciduous woodland with thick bushy undergrowth at its edges. If I looked left from my high point, I had a good view over the terrain. The air shimmered with heat. We stood 4-hour watches, turn and turn about, with 2 panzers each. At last we could wash. There was little water, but each of the 5 crew received a bowlful. It felt good. Usually we washed our hands with petrol. The night passed quietly and I slept well again. I had a lot of sleep to catch up on. Panzer Regiment 25 continued to protect the division's left flank. No great change was expected for the following day. I was summoned to the regimental commander. He gave me the task of reconnoitring the wood in the valley bottom. Tank noises had been heard there during the night. 2 of my panzers stood watch on the ridge, giving me covering fire at the same time. I led, accompanied by Feldwebel Weigel's Tiger. Hatches shut, battle readiness, panzer marsch. We rolled slowly down the long slope through open country towards the wood. 400 metres short of it we stopped to observe. Nothing was to be seen. We continued forward, and then suddenly there was a flash. For a fraction of a second I could see the shell heading directly for me. It hit the bow of the panzer, and so did the second one. The air was shimmering. I couldn't make out anything and fired an explosive shell towards where I suspected the source to be. We received another hit, this time from the right. I pulled back and drove in reverse to our starting point. Both Tigers had some fresh scars each, but nothing had penetrated. There was less concern about a shell entering than a hit to the lateral gearing, which would have put the drive wheel out of action. It was our weak point, and the Russians knew it. The 2 panzers I had left behind on watch had seen everything and also opened fire. They saw 2 SP assault guns appear at the edge of the wood, fired at them and then withdrew behind cover. I reported the incident to the commander orally. Now we had to be doubly cautious so as to avoid any nasty surprises. In the evening, Feldwebel Grohmann, our 3-company orderly room sergeant, came by with mail and a box of Coca-Cola for everyone. He told me that Oberleutnant Scherf was in action with the company at Miaswedovo. Gefreiter Albrecht Schmidt had fallen there on the 8th of July. On the first day of the attack, Lieutenant Yamarath of our 1 company had been killed. He had been my classmate on the officers' course at the Panzer Training School at Wunsdorf. News like that came as a blow to remind me how many guardian angels I had had until then. Mail from home. Everything was all right there. The family was going to Oberbarenberg again. Yes, it was always so beautiful there. Next morning, while on watch, I could not believe my eyes. The Russians were pulling out of the wood. I had a brief glimpse of 3 tanks before they disappeared at great speed behind natural cover. By the time my gunner had got them in his sights, 2 more had appeared for a short time, and then also gone into cover. We fired but scored no hits, corrected for deflection, and this time got a hit, white smoke enveloping everything. We fired 1 more for luck, and all fell silent again. At least 10 enemy tanks had escaped us, but we had hit 1 for certain, and another fell by the wayside afterwards. At Panzer Regiment 25, meanwhile, a real military camp had been set up. People were tinkering with panzers, cleaning weapons, enjoying the sun, taking it easy, playing cards. How long would this El Dorado last? We also benefited from it. Our crews not on watch did the same, a break in order to generate energy. I went to the regimental HQ several times. There was nothing new to report regarding the situation. I had a schnapps with the commander. I was slowly becoming a person again. On the morning of the 11th of July 1943, I received orders to drive back to 3 Company with my platoon. I was shown the meeting point a few kilometres away, marked on the map. This ended my attachment to Panzer Regiment 25. I reported with my platoon to the regimental commander. "Well done," he said. "It was a good cooperation." The way to 3 Company led past Miasoedovo through an area not yet securely in German hands. To avoid this uncertain region would require a long detour, and therefore I decided for the shorter route. When we got to no man's land, I ordered battle readiness, seal hatches, and prepare for action. Everything went well, however, and I thought we had come through. Suddenly, at a bend in the road with much undergrowth, there came a flash from close range. We were hit. Inside the Panzer it fell dark, the interior lighting failed. I hung jammed by my arm between the gun deflector plate and the turret roof. Ziegler reversed. Everything happened automatically and in seconds. The Tiger, half right behind me, fired an HE shell and destroyed an artillery piece which had taken up position on the concealed section of road only 30 metres ahead of us. An HE shell had hit the cylindrical shield of our gun. He shells, even of large calibre, could not penetrate us, though they still had considerable effect. The force of the shell had knocked the 8.8 centimetres gun of the Tiger from the toothed wheel of the elevation machinery, and the long barrel with muzzle brake, now no longer retained by the wheel, fell down, causing the breech of the gun with its apparatus to rise up and hit the turret roof. The Panzer commander's seat was to the left of the deflector plate. Because with every round fired the gun recoiled about 30 centimetres, the deflector protected both the commander and the loader on the other side. If the hatch was shut and the commander's seat was at its lowest position, the deflector offered a ledge upon which to rest one's right elbow. This is what I had done, and now my arm was jammed between the deflector and the turret roof. Fortunately, the elevating machinery was still functioning, and the gun could be brought horizontal again. This allowed me to be freed, but there was a lot of bleeding. The gunner, Unteroffizier Fuhrmeister, applied a temporary dressing, and I sat back in my commander's seat in a state of shock, and the Panzer got going again, though with another Panzer leading. Once again my guardian angel had saved me. If the hatch had been open, I would have been killed. No more incidents occurred. Finally, a white flare rose skywards ahead of us. This meant our own troops. We replied with a white light and approached a vehicle of 7 reconnaissance apt. We had made it. Just another 15 minutes' drive with open hatches, and we arrived at the meeting point ordered. I reported my return to Oberleutnant Schurf. The Abteilungssurgeon, Stabsarzt Dr. Schramm, attended to my wound. The sleeve of my jacket was cut away. I had a flesh wound the size of the palm of my hand down to the bone of the right elbow, and a fractured radius. Next day I was admitted to the military hospital at Kharkov. For me, Operation Citadel was over. It was especially important for me that I had no one killed in my platoon. A company car took me to Kharkov. I spent one night in my old quarters where I had left my valise, for I had gone off into battle with a soldier's pack only. I kept everything I needed for my stay in hospital. The rest I sent home via the company. I did not know how long I would be away, nor whether I would be returning to the company. Next day I had them take me to hospital, and not before time. The wound on my right elbow was the size of a hand, the bone was fully exposed, and everything was inflamed. I was deemed unfit to travel and stayed in Kharkov for 14 days. To my roommate, an infantry colonel, I dictated letters to my family, brother and sisters, to inform them that I was hors de combat, but that there was no reason to worry. I had a visit from Frau von Hörnersdorf, the head of the soldiers' hostel at Kharkov. Her husband, the commanding officer of 6th Panzer Division, General von Hörnersdorf, fell a few days later in Operation Citadel. The Red Cross nurses did everything they could to feed me up. I could have anything I liked and ordered an omelette soufflé. It was gigantic and made me feel ill. My right arm was fixed stretched out. Every day the discharge of matter got worse. Nevertheless, I was quite content to have nothing to do, nothing to decide and nobody to order around, having left all the horror behind me and being able to allow my thoughts to roam back to my comrades in arms and the company, forward to more rest, my parents' Germany. Finally, I was declared fit to travel. I was flown to Dnya-Propetrovsk, where I spent the next 10 days and then boarded an ambulance train for Germany. I believe it took 6 days, just like a holiday trip. I had an upper bunk by a window, but couldn't get up. Food and treatment were first class. Twice a day a doctor visited. It was made clear to me how lucky I'd been. Immediately below me lay a young lieutenant, completely paralyzed. Every day a doctor came to empty his intestines with rubber gloves. Dreadful to be without any hope of a future, only able to continue vegetating with the help of others. Our train made slow progress. The rails were held together by simple bolts, and no great speed was possible. Again and again there were long halts. Every ambulance train had a travelling security squad, armed soldiers distributed to individual coaches and on the locomotive. The whole rear area through which we travelled was infested with partisans. They made daily attacks on the railway line, and trains also were attacked, including hospital trains, although these were always identified with the Red Cross symbol. Between the 7th of July and the 3rd of August 1943, alone in the Army Group Centre area, partisans derailed 56 trains. In the course of August, they destroyed the tracks in over 12,000 places. Right and left along the stretch of railway line, we saw overturned and burnt-out wagons. We came through unscathed, however. Our destination was Lublin in Poland. Here I was hospitalized again after a thorough delousing. Now came the selection process. A patient would be sent to one or other German hospital depending on the nature and seriousness of his wound. In Lublin, one had the sensation of being almost home. I discovered with great pleasure that my room nurse was a young Red Cross assistant from Rastatt and a former school friend of my elder sister. They would not let you know where you were going to end up. The new hospital train headed for Saxony. I would have found Dresden to be just right for my stay in hospital, but my carriage kept going. We were unloaded at Zwickau. A wing of the great provincial hospital there had been set aside as a reserve military hospital. I arrived on the 21st of August 1943 and remained there until the 12th of February 1944. My parents and sister Elizabeth visited me on their return from Oberbarenburg, and I spent 8 days' Christmas leave at home with them. At the Zwickau Military Hospital I received a small packet and a letter from the commander of Panzer Regiment 25, Oberstleutnant Schulz. Enclosed was the Iron Cross First Class. Wear the Iron Cross long in the best of health. At the same time, may it be a reminder of the time you spent with the regiment in heavy fighting. A few months later, as General Major and Commander of 7 Panzer Division, he fell in the East. He was the 6th soldier of the Wehrmacht to be awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords and diamonds. My wound healed very slowly and lasted until the suppurations stopped. Having to dictate all my letters got on my nerves, and so I learned to write with my left hand. I even did some sketches, but none has survived. My right arm was completely stiff. Every couple of days under anaesthetic, the doctors moved it forcibly and then put it in a plaster cast at the desired angle. I would stay in bed for a day after that. When the anaesthetic wore off, the pain was hellish. Between these appointments, I had a chance to visit the theatre, concerts and the cinema. I was determined to make the best of the time. I had contact with my company, mainly with Lieutenant Weinert, who fell that November. I also received news of the death of von Kossel. My stay in hospital was rounded off with a course in Bonn for convalescing officers. I gave this short shrift and went to Paderborn, where our Tiger Reserve Abteilung was stationed, hoping as always to be sent for by Scherf. Instead of that, I caught diphtheria, was admitted into the Leo Convicts Isolation Hospital at Paderborn, and not discharged until the end of April 1944. I received another period of convalescent leave which passed very pleasantly, and then finally came orders from 503.